Making territorial gains in Victoria 3 can be achieved through war or other diplomatic means. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that so that you can fight and win wars or take territory through other sneakier ways. Let's begin by looking at Brazil, who's a pretty good case study, starting just a few years after the games began in 1839. The first step to interacting with a country in any sort of meaningful way, and by meaningful I mean outside of the bare bones basics. So if I wanted to interact with Sokoto over here, I can only really do basic things, right? We can open up their diplomacy and we can only really interact with nations that are within our declared interest zones. And depending on your relative power level, your prestige, the size of your nation, really your ranking, you'll determine how many of these strategic interests you can play. The game will default them, a lot of them. Sometimes they make sense, other times they don't. But the way that they're demonstrated is by being highlighted in the blue. So you can see over here at the moment is Brazil. I had an interest in the Rhine. Might just remove that for the time being. So I've just removed all of mine, and now you can see the entire world is ready for me to declare an interest. In this case, of course, I'm probably interested in talking at the moment to my nearest and dearest neighbors. So I'm going to declare these three areas as interests, and then maybe an accompanying one elsewhere for future. The interest will take a little bit to tick over. It's really not that long. In a matter of weeks, your old ones will disappear, and your new ones will be replaced. Now that we've swiped right on our neighbors, we can also have a look at this overview to get a feel for who likes us, Venezuela in this case, with the love hearts, and who doesn't? Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, not so much our biggest fans. They may be likely to join each other in conflict or over other diplomatic issues. We could also, of course, get a better feel for that by clicking into any one of them and having a look at their diplomatic sense. Here you can see if they're maybe improving relations and who they're doing it with. Also, if they have some other sort of more complicated thing. In this case, Peru is a puppet of Bolivia, and they have us as their rival. Once we have our declared interests ready, you'll notice there are a whole load of new interactions that we can make, including improving or damaging relations, as well as trade, making them a protectorate, changing their internal politics, or of course taking them over in various ways, puppeting them or completely conquering them. We could also seek treaty ports and all kinds of other things. In order to do this, all we have to do is share a diplomatic interest with a country. Obviously, we've shared it with everyone here, and there may be other nations that might look to share them with us. Here, for example, we can interact with Great Britain, even though we don't have them as a declared interest, they have declared interests with us. You can only declare one interest at a time. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to declare that I'm going to conquer the state of Uruguay. Bam! When I do that, I can see who I may face as an enemy, and other countries that may be swayed into joining the conflict. However, when we checked out their diplomacy earlier, we noted that they didn't really have anybody with them, unlike Peru, for example, so they're probably an easier or safer target. The diplomatic play has 3 stages, and on 5 speed, they advance, as you can see, very quickly. The first stage, second stage, and third stage are all equally important, but really it's the second escalation phase where the dirty work happens. Here we could add additional war goals if we want to. So if this diplomatic play does result in conflict, again, it may or may not, sometimes they may just cede their territory or give in to your demands, we could also force other things upon them. It is during this escalation phase that other nations may be swayed to join a conflict. In this case, unfortunately for me, the Austrians have decided to side with Uruguay. I can see that out of all of my potential friends, the only one that I could sway is the United States of America. They could be swayed into the conflict, in this case, by offering an obligation to them. I could choose to accept that if I want them to reinforce, or I could go ahead with the diplomatic play. If it looks like it's moving towards the final stage, which is, spoiler alert, where tensions really have escalated and warfare may be about to break out, then you'll want to make sure that you navigate to your military screen. Firstly, you can activate your conscripts during this conflict phase. If you're really desperate, you might need to conscript all of your populations from all of your population centers that have been incorporated. Otherwise, you might be able to leave some people behind, and you may wish to mobilize your generals. If you haven't already recruited more, you could also look to do that. Sometimes additional generals may provide more unique benefits. This general, for example, is direct, increasing their popularity and their offensive strength. As I'm waging an offensive war, I might look to recruit them to my Brazilian HQ. The recruitment locations, or the HQs, are of course determined back over on the building screen, here by barracks, for example. Building additional barracks in the region would provide additional HQs, and if we had territories overseas where we were building them, then they would get battalions over there, for example. Take note, of course, that mobilizing your generals will put a cost, a fairly steep cost on the economy, and once they're mobilized, they will be ready to be assigned to the front lines. In this case, the front line is fairly simple. It's literally just one line. However, of course, more complicated conflicts might have multiple. And, of course, there's also the sea to consider as well. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll get access to your generals and admirals, or, of course, you can, if you wish, navigate back to the military screen here for a closer look at who they are and what they offer. The AI will control the battle for you, so you don't need to worry too much so long as your generals are mobilized. But if you'd like to have a slightly more stronger or influential role over the battle, you can choose to either advance each general and their battalions. You could choose to defend a front line. This is good if you're maybe at the back end of a conflict, struggling a bit. You can try and sort of hold up a bit of a wall and grind the enemy down rather than suffer losses. Or, of course, they will be on standby, waiting to be deployed. In this case, I'm going to send them to advance this front line. I'm going to send 2 generals to advance the front line, and I could keep 1 spare and opt to do a naval invasion. Because, of course, in Victoria 3, while we may not have much of an air force, really, we do have a navy. Here we could look to, again, embark on a naval invasion, or do things like raid convoys if our navy was a little bit smaller, but we still wanted to try and help the fight. We could also patrol coastline and escort our own convoys to ensure that trade gets through. Unfortunately, the countdown to war has begun as escalation continued and neither side backed down. War has now been declared. And in this case, there's a lot of people fighting against me, but notice they're quite far away. This is a bit of an odd one for a tutorial, but there are probably some lessons to be learnt here. So let's demonstrate why, potentially even a threat like this, if they're all the way overseas, might not be able to get here in time to make a difference. To arms. Now that we're at war, we can see a slightly different interface, and this is how warfare plays out in Victoria 3. Each front line is represented by a series of battles. They'll show up as flags later on the map. You can see the generals who are participating in the front, and you can click into the active battle. Get a sense for who is winning or losing the battle by this slider here, as well as how many battalions they have available, how they're going, what their morale looks like, and the kind of losses that they've already suffered. You'll also see their equipment here, which you may of course wish to upgrade if you want your troops to be more effective. That's one of the key ways to make your troops more effective. That, and of course, the generals who are in charge of them, and maybe you might be looking to make broader changes to your government, politics, who's in charge of the country, to increase it as well. One notable example will be, of course, your army model. You may wish to change this, away from peasant levies that a lot of places start on, and towards more of a professional army for increased barracks level, conscription centre max level, and the conscription rate. You'll notice that National Militia allows me to mobilize 107 battalions, mass conscription 85. So all of these things will have different impacts on the size of your army, the number of troops you can have, and then of course you'll be looking at their equipment. To do that, again, briefly, in case we haven't already covered it in a separate tutorial or guide, you can navigate to the development building section here and figure out the different production methods. Here I could kit out my line infantry upgrade instead of what they were as irregular infantry before. There'll also be additional upgrades to things like artillery. I think you probably get the idea here. Navigating back to the front line, this will of course play out automatically if we want, or we could assign and unassign different orders. The one order that we weren't able to assign before the fighting began was the naval invasion. So we could navigate back to the military screen here and plot a naval invasion with the one general who we've left on standby. Fabio, get in there. And now we wait. If we hover over this part here, we can see that there are 19 more divisions or battalions traveling here. Austria, has 19 more traveling towards the front. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the active conflict at play. Clicking into it, you'll get a little bit more information about which side is winning or losing, the overall cost of the war, as well as how many troops have fallen. Here, you'll also see the peace menu, where once your war support is driven, or at least comfortably driving, while theirs has plummeted into the red at -100, you'll be able to propose a peace deal. Conquer Uruguay, and then click it to change to accept. Eventually, if you really crush them, they will just capitulate and cede to your war goals, whatever they may have been and however many you may have added. Clicking into the advancing front line, you can of course see which nation is winning by the advancement of their flag. As our naval invasion has landed and I click into this front, you can see that the active battles are somewhat going in my way, although reinforcements have now arrived from Austria. It will now probably see a slight change to this front line and the entire dynamics of the war. Changing my admiral to raiding convoys, I might try and cut off the Austrian supply line. Even though they outnumber me with the number of troops that they have on offer, they don't yet outnumber me on the front line. And you can see by hovering over it, generally speaking, I have the advantage in terms of units. However, we have an average of 35 offense, whereas they have defense of 43. That means it will be somewhat more difficult for us to fight the offensive war, and at this point you could consider holding the line defensively and changing these generals' orders to try and increase the attrition and losses on the enemy side and hold them out. At the moment, though, the war is progressing pretty well, and war support for Uruguay has fallen. Here you can see on the right-hand side of the screen a breakdown of exactly what is causing that. Generally speaking, it's occupied land that will do the most damage. If a conflict wages on for a while, you may find that other units become available to be conscripted, or if you're still producing barracks, like I should absolutely be doing here, then you may have additional battalions available to be recruited as well. You could of course do this by returning to activate conscripts, or recruiting or mobilizing new generals where extra battalions have been created. You'll notice I've swapped over temporarily here to play as Great Britain. That's because I want to demonstrate what can happen when war wages on for a long time, or when you're warring as a larger power. Here you can see I have currently 2 active conflicts. This is entirely possible, especially where war is declared on you, and it's doing us, well, it's hurting the national economy. A few things you can do during prolonged conflict to manage it, or if you need a burst of supply, is to, of course, look at your budget. Now, I have a full video, a beginner's guide, and also a separate video looking at the early game to give you some tips on how to manage this. You can check those out on the channel. Shameless self-plug. But after we've clicked the like button, we might want to return back to the budget screen, where, of course, you could temporarily raise taxes, fixing your budget woes. Alternatively, though, during times of war, you may want to pay particular attention to your military wages. At the cost a little bit, and to be honest, actually not even that massive of a cost, a slight loss in armed forces approval, you can slash their wages, and by slashing their wages, you'll save a lot of money. You can see just by slashing it down from medium to low, I immediately salvage our balance, and we're now in the green, some £4,000. That's a very simple change to fix the economy. The other thing that you may need to fix, and your situation log will probably be screaming out at you, not only with your battalions and reserve that you might want to resupply with, but also with your goods in general and market access. Here we see military goods are a big problem, and this of course will happen, especially when conflict wages on. There are 2 things you can do to fix it, depending on who you're playing and where you're playing, and they both involve the market. Navigating over to the market on the left-hand side, or using your lens down the bottom, you can see your trade routes. You may have a whole load of inactive ones to scrap, but more importantly, you might need to import goods, particularly military goods that you're shy on. Ammunition, for example, maybe we need to import it. This can be a quick fix, providing you have convoys available through your harbors, and of course that your seas are protected. You may be able to quickly pull in some trade and try and level it up with time. In this case, we're going to grab some American bullets to help fuel our aggression. You might also look to navigate to something like small arms, where in this case, instead of trading for it, maybe we want to produce them ourselves. A better, perhaps, long-term play. You can swap to applications to see where anything is being produced, and what it's being used by. Of course, our barracks and conscription centers are under a lot of pressure at the minute, so maybe we want to build more arms industries. We can produce these ourselves, of course, in any of our territories. And to take it one step further, you could also go in and look at really baseline raw materials. An example for that might be artillery, where under its applications, of course, produced by the arms industries, but maybe it's requiring additional resources lower down inside of its supply chains. For example, the shipyards, another one, where when we delve in, we find that they're using fabric, wood, engines, and hardwood. So you may also need to check down your supply lines to make sure for future conflicts or prolonged conflicts that you're managing not just the military and the front lines, but also the goods and the services and the people, crucially, that are required to keep your war functioning. And just like that, capitulation has been achieved. The following war goals were enforced on Uruguay. We conquered their territory. And you'll notice the conflict has now shifted to a more interesting front. We're still at war with Austria. However, with them being unable to really bring a lot over here and being absolutely preoccupied in their own continent, it's unlikely that this war for them will be successful. Their exhaustion will increase, and they will eventually lose, providing I have the defense to keep myself safe, which I absolutely do. It therefore means that the conflict with Uruguay was a success, and they are now part of, successfully, Brazil. We could look finally, as a quick tip here, to incorporate them into the state, bring them within our culture. It'll cost a little bit, it'll take a little bit of time, but it might be worthwhile doing to formally incorporate them into the now slightly larger Brazil. Hopefully that's been a great introduction to you for all kinds of diplomatic plays and, crucially, war and conflict in Victoria 3. In a nutshell, that's how you carry it out. Hopefully you'll find success. Do let me know in the comments below. I'm really enjoying covering Victoria 3, and the feedback I've received so far has been fantastic. So thank you so much for that, and I'll see you next time.